I asked about the grand opening of my son's hotel, the project I had invested $520,000 in. My daughter-in-law said casually, "Oh, that happened 10 weeks ago. Only close family and friends." My chest tightened. In that moment, I realized the truth to them. I was not a father. I was just an ATM machine. But I quickly regained my composure. I had begun making a plan. I would make sure they would learn a lesson they would never forget. Thanks for joining me today. Please like, subscribe, and comment where you're from. Whether near or far, I wish you abundant health. Quick note, this story is fictional, created for reflection. Names and events are imaginary. Any resemblance to reality is coincidental. Now let's dive into a father's $520,000 lesson about love and accountability. Did you get the invoice I sent last Thursday? No greeting, no, "How are you, Brian?" Just business delivered in the clipped tone of someone checking off a task list. I sat at my kitchen table in Pooler, Georgia, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the empty chair across from me. The one where my wife Catherine used to sit every morning. That chair had been empty for 5 years now, ever since the heart attack took her on a Sunday morning. One moment she was laughing, the next she was gone. Catherine would have known what to say to Natalie right now. "I haven't checked my email," I said carefully. "What invoice?" A pause. "Not the thoughtful kind, the impatient kind. For the hotel," Natalie said. "We have some outstanding vendor payments. Christopher thought you'd want to review them before we proceed." Christopher thought. The words landed heavy. My son hadn't called me in 8 weeks. Not for Sunday dinner, not for my birthday, not even a quick text. And now his wife was calling about invoices. I thought back to the day Christopher walked into this kitchen 2.5 years ago, a leather folder under his arm, and hope written all over his face. He'd just turned 29, still young enough to believe in second chances. "Dad," he'd said, spreading architectural sketches across this same table. "I found it. Forsyth Manor, a historic building on Bull Street in Savannah. 14 rooms, original details, a courtyard for weddings. It just needs vision. And capital." The number he'd landed on was $500,000 to $20,000. Nearly everything I'd saved over 34 years teaching business and economics at Georgia Southern University. But when I looked at my son that afternoon, I didn't see a risky investment. I saw a man who'd struggled for years, finally finding something worth fighting for. So I said yes. I wrote 3 checks over 6 months, $200,000 in May, another $200,000 in August, and $120,000 in November. I transferred the money into an account Christopher set up for renovations, and I didn't ask for a contract. I didn't ask for collateral. I didn't even ask for a formal repayment plan. I can almost hear Catherine's voice. "Brian, you teach due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. Don't you owe yourself the same standard?" But I'd waved away those concerns, real or imagined. This was different, I told myself. This was family. This was trust. This was what fathers did. Maybe that was my first mistake. I'd spent more than 3 decades in lecture halls teaching students about business ethics and risk management. I'd graded hundreds of case studies on entrepreneurs who lost everything because they mixed personal feelings with financial decisions. I knew better. Hell, I'd taught better. But knowing and doing are different things. "I'll check my email tonight," I told Natalie, setting down my mug harder than I meant to. "And I'd like to talk to Christopher directly. Is he available?" Another pause. Longer this time. "He's been really busy with the soft opening," she said. "I'm handling the administrative side, but I'll let him know you called." Soft opening. The words stopped me cold. "Natalie," I said slowly, "when did the hotel open?" She hesitated just long enough for me to know I wouldn't like the answer. "About 10 weeks ago," she said. "We didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Christopher was nervous about the pressure about meeting expectations. We thought it'd be better to ease into things quietly." 10 weeks. 2.5 months. My son had opened a hotel I'd funded with over $500,000, and no one had told me. "I see," I said, though I didn't see it all. "I'll resend the invoice," Natalie said brightly, as if the hard part of the conversation was over. "Just let me know when you've reviewed it. Thanks, Brian." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, then at the empty chair across from me. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. The house settled into the kind of silence that felt too big, too heavy. I picked up my coffee mug. The ceramic was cool against my palm now, the liquid inside stone cold. I set it back down without drinking. Something wasn't right. Something about the way Natalie had rushed through that conversation, the way she'd casually mentioned a soft opening like it was an afterthought, the way Christopher hadn't called me himself in 2 months. A feeling crept up from somewhere deep in my chest. Not quite anger, not quite fear. Something closer to dread. The kind of unease you get when you realize you've missed something important, something obvious, and now it's too late to go back and fix it. I'd taught business ethics for 34 years. I'd warned hundreds of students about the dangers of blind trust, about the importance of documentation, about the difference between love and liability. And here I was, sitting in an empty kitchen, holding a cold cup of coffee, wondering why my own son had let his wife make a phone call that should have come from him. Why hadn't Christopher called me himself? Why hadn't he invited me to the opening? And what else hadn't he told me? I sat there in that quiet kitchen a long time after Natalie hung up, turning her words over in my mind like stones I couldn't quite fit together. 10 weeks. The hotel had been open for 10 weeks, and no one had thought to call. But it hadn't always been like this. I leaned back in my chair and let my mind drift to the beginning, to the months right after I'd said yes to Christopher's dream. Back then, everything had felt right. Back then, I'd believed I was doing what a father should do. The first transfer went through in May of 2018. $200,000. I remember sitting at this same table with my laptop, open, fingers hovering over the keyboard, before I clicked, confirm. Catherine had been gone for 3 years by then, and the house still felt too big, too empty. Funding Christopher's hotel gave me something to look forward to, something to believe in. When the transaction cleared, I called my son to let him know. "Dad, I can't believe you're doing this," he'd said, and I could hear the catch in his voice. "I'm going to make you proud. I promise." The second transfer came in August. Another 200,000. By then, Christopher was sending me photos every few days. Scaffolding going up, old wallpaper being stripped away, the courtyard being cleared of decades of overgrowth. He'd video call me on Sunday evenings, walking me through the property room by room, talking about crown molding and original hardwood floors, like they were treasures he'd discovered himself. "We found the original fireplace mantles in the basement, Dad," he'd said one night, holding his phone up to show me the carved wood. "Can you believe someone covered these up? We're going to restore every single one." I loved those calls. They reminded me of when Christopher was a boy, showing me his science fair projects, or the model rockets we'd built together in the garage. For the first time in years, my son sounded alive. The final transfer, $120,000, went through in November. By then, the renovations were in full swing. Christopher had hired a small crew, found a general contractor he trusted, and started mapping out the interior design. He'd even sketched out ideas for the courtyard string lights, wrought iron tables, potted magnolias. "It's going to be perfect, Dad," he'd told me. "Exactly what Savannah needs." and I believed him. For those first several months, Christopher called every Sunday like clockwork. 7 o'clock in the evening, right after I'd finished dinner. We'd talk for an hour, sometimes more. He'd tell me about permit delays and supplier issues, about paint colors and furniture orders. I'd listen, ask questions, offer advice when he asked for it. Those conversations became the highlight of my week. But then, Natalie got more involved. It started about 18 months ago, spring of 2019. Christopher mentioned casually one Sunday that Natalie had offered to take over the financial side of things. She had experience in healthcare administration, he said, and she was good with budgets and spreadsheets. It would free him up to focus on the guest experience, on building relationships with local vendors and tourism boards. "It makes sense, Dad," he'd said. "Natalie's really good at this stuff, and honestly, it's not my strong suit." I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed reasonable, smart even. A husband and wife team dividing responsibilities based on their strengths. But the calls started changing after that. Christopher's updates became shorter, more surface level. Instead of walking me through every decision, he'd give me quick summaries. "Things are moving along. Natalie's handling the numbers. We're on track." When I'd ask follow-up questions, he'd promise to get back to me with details, but those details rarely came. The Sunday calls stretched from every week to every other week. Then once a month, then not at all. I told myself it was normal. The man was busy. He was building a business from the ground up. Of course, he didn't have time to call his father every week. But a small voice in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a lot like Catherine, kept whispering that something was off. Around that same time, my older son Marcus started asking questions. Marcus is 9 years older than Christopher, my son from my first marriage to Sarah Mitchell. We divorced when Marcus was 10, and though I'd tried to stay present in his life, the distance between Pooler and Atlanta made it harder than I wanted to admit. Marcus had grown up resourceful, independent, driven. By the time he was 30, he'd founded a tech company. By 35, he'd sold it and started another. He didn't need anything from me, not money, not advice, not validation. But he called me regularly. More regularly than Christopher, if I was being honest. "Dad, have you drawn up any formal agreements with Chris?" Marcus had asked me one Saturday afternoon, maybe 6 months ago. He'd driven down from Atlanta for the weekend, and we were sitting on my back porch, drinking sweet tea. "It's family, Marcus," I'd said. "We don't need contracts." Marcus had set his glass down carefully, the way he did when he was choosing his words. "Family's exactly why you do need contracts. It protects everyone. You've taught business ethics your whole career, you know this." "Christopher's not you," I'd said more defensively than I meant to. "He's not running a tech startup. He's trying to build something real, something tangible. He needs support, not scrutiny." Marcus had looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Dad. Just keep an eye on things, okay?" I should have listened to him, because over the past 8 weeks, the silence from Christopher had become absolute. No Sunday calls, no text messages, no photos of the hotel's progress. When I'd try calling, I'd get voicemail. When I'd text, I'd get one-word responses hours later, busy, sorry, later. I'd made excuses for him. I'd told myself he was in the final push before opening, that he was overwhelmed, that he'd reach out once things settled down. But now I knew the truth. The hotel hadn't been in its final push. It had already opened 10 weeks ago. And my son hadn't invited me. Hadn't even told me. I stood up from the kitchen table, my cold coffee forgotten. Outside, the late afternoon sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear kids playing a lawnmower, running the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood going about its Saturday. But I couldn't sit here and pretend everything was ordinary. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door, pulled on my jacket, and checked my watch. It was just past 4 o'clock. Savannah was only 20 minutes away. If I left now, I could be there before dark. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send a text. I just walked out to my car, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. Whatever was happening at Forsyth Manor, I was going to see it for myself. The drive from Pooler to Savannah took 19 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire way, hands tight on the steering wheel, as I merged onto I-95 South. The late afternoon sun cut through the windshield, casting long shadows across the highway. Traffic was light, just a few trucks and families heading into the city for dinner. By the time I took the exit toward Savannah's historic district, my jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. Bull Street was quieter than I expected. The golden light filtered through old oaks draped in Spanish moss, the faint smell of jasmine hanging in the air. Tourists strolled the sidewalks taking photos. A couple shared pralines on a bench near Forsyth Park. I slowed as I approached the address Christopher had given me 2.5 years ago. And there it was. Forsyth Manor. I pulled into a parking spot across the street and cut the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the building my son had poured my money into. It was beautiful. 3 stories of historic brick-tall windows with fresh white trim, a black iron gate leading into a courtyard. The kind of place that belonged on a postcard. But it wasn't the beauty that caught my attention. It was the details. I'd spent 34 years teaching students how to analyze businesses, how to read the story behind the surface. I'd trained myself to notice what others overlooked. And this building was telling me a story Christopher hadn't. I got out of the car and crossed the street. Slowly, my mind already cataloging what I saw. The sign above the entrance, black iron with gold lettering reading Forsyth Manor, was elegant, but the edges of the gold paint had started to fade just slightly. The way paint does after months of Georgia sun and humidity. A brand new sign would still be crisp and bright. This one wasn't. I moved closer, staying on the sidewalk, trying to look like just another tourist. The landscaping had that established look that only comes with time. Boxwoods lined the walkway, their roots clearly settled, their shape full and healthy. The magnolia trees flanking the entrance weren't newly planted saplings they'd already put on a season's growth. I could see it in the bark, the way the branches had spread. You don't get that in a week or two. You get it over months. Near one of the magnolias, an irrigation system kicked on with a soft hiss. Water sprayed in a perfect arc. The system was programmed, running on a schedule. That takes weeks to install and calibrate. I walked past the entrance and glanced through a ground floor window. The glass was clean, but not too clean. Faint smudges near the bottom, handprints from guests. Water spots along the edges from rain and sprinklers. A newly opened hotel would have spotless windows wiped down religiously. These windows had settled into a routine. Through the glass, I could see the lobby. A velvet sofa, a coffee table with magazines, a potted fern. The magazines weren't perfectly arranged. They were slightly askew, the way they get after guests flip through them. I stepped back and looked up. On a second-floor balcony, 2 wrought iron chairs angled toward each other. Between them, a small table with a half-empty wine bottle and 2 glasses. Guests had been here. Recently. I pulled out my phone and opened the calculator, running the math the way I used to for case studies. Paint fade on the sign, 6 to 8 weeks minimum. Growth on the magnolias, 8 to 10 weeks. Irrigation system operational for at least a month. Wear on the windows, weeks of cleaning and guest traffic. Balcony furniture not staged, used. 10 weeks. Natalie had said 10 weeks, and every detail confirmed it. My son had opened this hotel, this beautiful, clearly successful hotel, 10 weeks ago, and he hadn't told me. I stood there on Bull Street, golden light turning everything soft around me, and felt something cold settle into my chest. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't Christopher getting too busy to call. You don't forget to invite your father to the opening of a business he funded with over $500,000. You don't forget to send a single photo, a single text, a single acknowledgement. You only do that if you're hiding something, or if someone's convinced you to. I thought about Natalie's voice on the phone, the way she'd glossed over the soft opening like it was nothing. Christopher was nervous about the pressure. We thought it'd be better to ease into things quietly. Quietly, without the man who'd made it all possible. My hands curled into fists. I forced myself to breathe slowly to push down the anger. Getting emotional wouldn't help. I needed to think clearly the way I'd taught my students when faced with incomplete information. I pulled out my phone and called Christopher. 4 rings. Voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Voicemail again. I tried Natalie. Straight to voicemail. She'd either turned off her phone or sent me there the moment she saw my name. I stood there staring at my phone, a knot tightening in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I looked back at Forsyth Manor one more time. From the outside, it looked perfect. A dream realized, a business thriving. But I'd been teaching business long enough to know the outside rarely tells the whole story. I turned and walked back to my car. I needed information. Financial records, contracts, reports. I needed to know what was really happening inside that building. But more than that, I needed to know why my son was avoiding me. I slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The drive back to Pooler felt longer, the silence heavier. The sun was dipping below the trees, casting everything in shades of orange and purple. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the question had taken root so deeply I could barely think about anything else. What the hell is happening inside those walls? I stared at my phone screen, the notification light blinking at me like an accusation. 2 missed calls. Both from Christopher. The first had come Friday evening at 7:30, right when most people were finishing dinner, winding down for the weekend. A time when any reasonable person would be available to talk. The second came Saturday morning at 9, early enough to catch someone before they started their day, but not so early it would seem desperate. Both times he'd left voicemails. I pressed play on the first one already, knowing I wouldn't like what I heard. "Hey, Dad. Sorry I missed your call. Things have been crazy here. I'll try you back tomorrow." His voice was flat, rehearsed. The kind of message you leave when you're fulfilling an obligation, not when you actually want to talk. The second voicemail was worse. "Dad, it's me again. Really sorry we keep missing each other. I know we need to talk. I'll call you Sunday, okay?" Sunday. He'd promised Sunday. I glanced at the clock on my desk. 6:15 Sunday evening. My phone had been on fully charged, sitting right next to me all day. And it had been silent. I set the phone down and felt something cold settle in my chest. Those weren't missed calls. Those were strategic calls made at times when Christopher knew, or at least hoped, I wouldn't answer. So he could leave a message and check the box without actually having to talk to me. Catherine would have called it what it was, avoidance. I couldn't wait anymore. I picked up the phone and called Natalie. She answered on the first ring. "Brian, hi." Her voice was bright, almost too bright. I remembered something Catherine used to say when she was principal at Oakwood Elementary. The ones who answer too fast have already prepared their story. "Natalie," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'd like to talk about the hotel." A beat of silence. "Of course," she said smoothly. "What would you like to know?" "You said yesterday the hotel had a soft opening 10 weeks ago. I'm trying to understand why no one told me." "It wasn't really an opening," she said carefully. "More like a trial run. We invited a few friends, some local contacts, just to test our systems. Christopher didn't want to make a big deal out of it." "A trial run," I repeated. "Right." He was worried about disappointing you if something went wrong during the real opening. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. But I'd spent the afternoon staring at that hotel, and nothing about it looked like a trial run. "Natalie, I drove to Savannah today," I said. "I saw the hotel." Silence. "The landscaping is established. The irrigation system is running on a schedule. The sign has weathered. That's not a trial run. That's a business that's been operating for months." I heard her inhale slowly. "We've been easing into things," she said. "Building slowly. Christopher wanted everything perfect before inviting family. I funded that hotel with $520,000, I said, hearing the edge creep into my voice. "I think I've earned the right to know when it opens." "You're absolutely right," Natalie said quickly, her tone shifting to something softer, more apologetic. "Christopher should have called. He's just been under so much pressure, Brian. The renovations, the permits, it was a nightmare. And when we finally opened, he was terrified it wouldn't live up to your expectations. So his solution was to say nothing. He was planning to call you this week. We were going to invite you for dinner, show you everything. He just needed a little more time to build his confidence." I closed my eyes. My son was 32 years old, running a business, managing employees, and apparently still too afraid to call his father. "Is Christopher available now?" I asked. "He's at the hotel. Sunday evenings are our busiest check-in time. But I'll tell him you called. I'm sure he'll reach out tonight. I've been hearing that for 8 weeks." "I know. I'm sorry. I'll make sure he calls tonight. I promise." The finality in her voice told me the conversation was over. "All right," I said. "I'll be waiting." She hung up. I sat there listening to the silence. Outside, a dog barked. A car passed. The house settled around me. I set the phone on my desk and stared at it. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. 9 o'clock. By 10, I knew Christopher wasn't calling. My patience was gone. I opened my laptop and pulled up my email account, scrolling back through 2 years of messages about the hotel. Every update Christopher had sent, every photo of renovation progress, every excited message about furniture deliveries and design choices. Then I opened my bank account and pulled up the transaction history. $520,000. 3 transfers. May 2018, August 2018, November 2018. I grabbed a notepad and started writing down every question I couldn't answer. What about operating capital hotels need more than renovation money? Who's listed on the ownership documents? What's the actual financial structure? Why is Natalie the only one returning my calls? The list kept growing. I stared at the screen, at the numbers, at the unanswered questions piling up in front of me. I'd taught business ethics for 34 years. I'd warned hundreds of students about the dangers of investing without documentation, about mixing family and finance, about the importance of contracts and oversight. And I'd done none of it. I needed help. Real help. Someone who could look at this situation objectively and tell me what I was missing. I needed an expert. The laptop screen cast a pale blue glow across my desk, the only light in the study as midnight crept closer. I'd been sitting here for over an hour, scrolling through 2 years of emails, clicking through attachments, opening spreadsheets I should have reviewed months ago. The more I looked, the worse it got. I'd told myself there had to be something, some formal agreement I'd forgotten about, some contract, buried in an email thread, some piece of documentation that would make me feel less like a fool. But there was nothing. Just friendly exchanges, excited updates from Christopher about paint colors and furniture deliveries, photos of renovation progress, budget estimates that looked professional on the surface but had no legal weight behind them. Not a single signed contract. Not a single formal investment agreement. Not even a promissory note outlining repayment terms. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. 34 years of teaching business students about the importance of documentation, and I'd handed over $500,000 on nothing but trust and a handshake. I opened my bank statements next, going line by line through the hotel-related transactions. The three big transfers I already knew about: $200,000, $200,000, $120,000. But as I kept scrolling, something else caught my eye. Starting about a year ago, there were regular payments going out. Smaller amounts, but consistent. Every month like clockwork. $3,200, $3,200, $3,200. I clicked on one of the transactions to see the recipient. LC Hospitality Solutions. I stared at the name. It meant nothing to me. I had no memory of approving payments to any company called LC Hospitality. I went back through my emails searching for any mention of the name. Nothing. I pulled up a calculator and did the math. 12 months of payments at $3,200 each. That was $38,400. $38,000 going to a company I'd never heard of for services I'd never approved. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone. It was almost 11:30 at night, but I didn't care. I scrolled to Marcus's number and hit call. He answered on the third ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Dad." "What's wrong?" "I need your help," I said. I heard movement on his end, probably sitting up in bed. "What happened?" I told him everything. The hotel opening I hadn't been invited to, Natalie's evasive explanations, Christopher's silence, and now this $38,400 in payments to a company I'd never authorized. Marcus was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "You need a forensic accountant." "I need to know what's going on in that hotel," I said. "Dad, listen to me. Don't try to investigate this yourself. You're too close to it. You need someone who can look at the books objectively. Someone who knows how to spot financial irregularities. I can give you a name, Kenneth Gray. He's retired, but he still takes on private cases. He's the best." "I also need a lawyer," I said. "Do you still talk to Howard Mills?" "Occasionally." "Why, call him tomorrow. Show him what you found. If there's money disappearing, you need to know where it's going and whether you have any legal recourse." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay. Dad." Marcus said, his voice softer now. "I know this is hard, but whatever you find out, you need to be prepared for it." "I know." "Do you—" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure I did. Monday morning, I called Howard Mills before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. "Brian," he said, when he answered, his voice warm and gravelly. "It's been too long. How are you?" "I need your advice," I said. "Can we meet?" There was a pause. Howard had known me long enough to read the tone in my voice. "Of course. When and where?" "Today, if you're free. I can drive into Savannah. There's a cafe on Broughton Street, the Gray Market. You know it. I'll find it. Noon. I'll be there." The Gray Market was one of those renovated historic buildings that Savannah did so well, exposed brick-high ceilings, the smell of fresh roasted coffee mixing with the scent of pastries. Howard was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a mug of black coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw me and we shook hands. At 70, Howard still had the bearing of the corporate attorney he'd been for 40 years. Sharp eyes, firm handshake, the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter. "You look tired," he said as we sat down. "I've had a rough weekend." "Tell me." So I did. I walked him through the whole thing, the investment, the silence, the discovery that the hotel had been open for months, the payments to LC Hospitality Solutions. Howard listened, without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he set down his coffee and leaned forward. "Brian, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any formal documentation for this investment?" "No. Nothing. No contract. No promissory note. No equity agreement. Nothing in writing. Just emails." Howard exhaled slowly. "And you're a business professor." "I know." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking he's my son." Howard's expression softened slightly. "I understand. But family doesn't protect you from fraud. And this," he gestured at the printouts I'd brought, "this has all the hallmarks of financial mismanagement at best and fraud at worst." The word hung in the air between us. Fraud. LC Hospitality Solutions. Howard continued, "Sounds like a shell company, a way to funnel money out of the business without raising red flags. Do you know who owns it?" "No." "That's the first thing you need to find out. If Christopher approved those payments, you need to know why. If he didn't approve them, then someone else has access to the hotel's finances, and that's a much bigger problem." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What should I do?" "Hire that forensic accountant your son recommended. Have him go through every transaction, every invoice, every contract related to the hotel. And don't tell Christopher or Natalie you're doing it. You think they're hiding something. Sigo, I think 10 weeks of silence combined with $38,000 in unexplained payments is more than enough reason to look closer." I nodded slowly. "If I find something, if Christopher's involved in something illegal, then you'll have to decide what kind of father you want to be," Howard said quietly. "The kind who protects his son from consequences, or the kind who teaches him there are consequences." I thought about Catherine, about what she would say if she were here. She'd want Christopher to face whatever he'd done. She'd want him to learn, even if it hurt. "I'll hire the accountant," I said. Howard reached across the table and put a hand on my shoulder. I know this is hard, but you're doing the right thing." I wasn't so sure. As I walked back to my car, the sun bright and warm on Broughton Street, all I could think about was how wrong everything felt. I wasn't worried about the money anymore. $500,000, $38,000, those were just numbers. What terrified me was the possibility that my son had looked me in the eye, taken my money, and then deliberately shut me out. And if that was true, I didn't know if our relationship would survive what I was about to uncover. Marcus made the call on Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, I was sitting across from Kenneth Gray at a coffee shop halfway between Pooler and Savannah. Kenneth was 58, with wire-rimmed glasses and the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent decades finding what others tried to hide. Retired from a Big Four firm, Marcus said, but still took forensic cases when they interested him. "Your son says you need someone to look at hotel finances," Kenneth said, opening his notepad. "So I need to know where my money went." He quoted $3,500 for a full audit. 2 weeks, maybe less. I wrote the check right there. "I'll need everything," Kenneth said. "Bank statements, invoices, contracts, emails." "You'll have it." He looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Carter, whatever I find, you need to be ready for it. Most families don't like what I uncover. I just need the truth." 2 weeks later, an email landed in my inbox, "Audit complete. Call when you can." My hand shook as I dialed. Kenneth answered immediately. "Mr. Carter, can you come to my office? This isn't a phone conversation." I was there in 20 minutes. Kenneth's office was precise labeled filing cabinets, spreadsheets covering his desk. He slid a bound report across to me. "Take a breath first," he said. I opened it. The first page had 3 bullet points, each one worse than the last. Kenneth tapped the first line. LC Hospitality Solutions, the company getting $3,200 a month from the hotel. I remember. It's owned by Lauren Crawford. 26 years old, lives in Jacksonville, works retail management. No hospitality experience. Nothing that justifies $38,400 in payments. I stared at the name. Crawford. Is she Natalie Crawford's younger sister? Yes. The room felt too small. So Natalie's been funneling money to her sister. It appears so. The invoices say consulting services, but there's no documentation of actual work. I flipped the page. A loan agreement. This is where it gets worse, Kenneth said. 6 months ago, someone took out a $150,000 business loan using the hotel as collateral. The signature says Christopher Carter. I looked closer. It looked like Christopher's handwriting. But it's a forgery, Kenneth continued. I had an analyst check. Good forgery, but not perfect. Whoever signed this practiced Christopher's signature, but the pressure points are wrong. Natalie. Most likely. She has signing authority on multiple accounts. Where did the $150,000 go? The account's been drained. Small withdrawals over time. Personal expenses, probably. Not going into the hotel. My chest tightened. There's one more thing. Kenneth slid another document forward. My personal bank statement. July 18th, a $15,000 cash withdrawal from your home safe. Do you remember making it? I stared at the date. July 18th. I'd been at the grocery store. No, I said. I didn't take that. Then someone else did. Someone with access to your home and your safe combination. Christopher. I'd given him a spare key years ago, and the safe combination, I'd written it down once, kept it in my desk drawer. He'd been in my study dozens of times. I can't prove who took it, Kenneth said gently. But the timing's suspicious. 3 days after the hotel opened. If your son needed cash. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I drove home in a fog. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there staring at the house. Then I called Marcus. Dad, what happened? Kenneth finished, and I told him everything. The payments to Lauren, the forged loan, the missing $15,000. When I mentioned the safe, Marcus went quiet. Dad, he said carefully, remember the security system I installed 6 months ago? I'd forgotten. Motion cameras at the doors and hallway. The footage saves to the cloud, Marcus said. Keeps recordings for a year. If someone was in your house July 18th, I was already at my laptop logging into the system. I pulled up July 18th, scrolled to midday, 12:47 p.m. The hallway camera caught everything. The front door opening. Christopher stepping inside, glancing around. Walking toward my study. The study camera showed him going straight to the safe, kneeling, entering the combination without hesitation. He knew it by heart. He opened the safe, pulled out the cash, $15,000, and shoved it into his jacket. He didn't count it. Just took it and left. 3 minutes start to finish. I sat there staring at the frozen frame long after it ended, my hands shaking. My son had stolen from me. Not in desperation, not as a last resort. He'd planned it. Waited until I was gone, used the key I'd trusted him with, and then avoided my calls for 2 months. The numbers in Kenneth's report: $38,400, $150,000, $15,000. They were devastating. They represented betrayal, fraud, everything I'd taught students not to do for 34 years. But watching my son walk into my home and steal from me that hurt in a way no dollar amount ever could. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. My heart felt like it was breaking. Through Howard's connections, I got my hands on a copy of the Forsyth Manor lease agreement. He'd called in a favor with someone at the property management firm, one of those quiet, professional courtesies that attorneys build over decades. By Thursday afternoon, a 43-page PDF sat in my inbox. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled in to read every word. The lease was for 15 years. Bull Street Historic District, Savannah. Monthly rent starting at $8,500 with annual increases tied to inflation. Standard commercial terms. For the most part, maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, permitted use of the property. But when I reached page 37, my coffee went cold in my hand. Personal guarantee clause. In the event of default, breach of contract, or business failure, the lessee, Christopher Michael Carter, agreed to personal liability for all outstanding rent damages and associated costs for the remainder of the lease term. I pulled up my calculator and started doing the math. If the hotel failed today, Christopher would be personally responsible for every remaining lease payment. 12.5 years, at an average of $9,000 per month, accounting for the inflation adjustments already written into the contract. That came to over $1.3 million. $1.3 million that Christopher would owe. Not the business, not an LLC. Him, personally. And with Natalie's fraudulent $150,000 loan and the $38,400 she'd siphoned to her sister, the hotel was already hemorrhaging money it couldn't afford to lose. If this business collapsed, my son wouldn't just lose his dream. He'd be financially ruined for decades, possibly the rest of his life. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen, my chest tight. Christopher had signed this. He'd put his name, his entire financial future on the line for a business he wasn't even properly managing. Or maybe he had no idea what kind of trap he'd walked into. Maybe Natalie had handled the paperwork and he'd signed without reading it carefully. Either way, he was in danger. Real danger. And he'd been too afraid or too ashamed to tell me. I spent the rest of that afternoon organizing everything into a single folder. Kenneth Gray's audit report went in first 40 pages of financial analysis, with highlighted sections marking every suspicious payment, every irregularity, every red flag. Then I added printed copies of my bank statements, showing the $38,400 in payments to LC Hospitality Solutions. The fraudulent loan documents with Christopher's forged signature, the lease agreement with its devastating personal guarantee clause, and finally, the security footage. I copied it to a flash drive, labeled it with the date and timestamp July 18th, 12:47 p.m., and tucked it into the folder's inner pocket. This was my evidence, everything I needed to prove what had been happening behind my back. But as I zipped the folder closed, something twisted deep in my chest. I'd spent 34 years teaching business ethics. I'd stood in front of lecture halls and told students about accountability, about transparency, about the consequences of financial fraud. I'd used case studies from Enron, WorldCom, Bernie Madoff, examples of people who'd lied, stolen, and destroyed lives. And I'd always told them the same thing: there are no exceptions. If you break the rules, you face the consequences. I'd believed it then. I still believed it now. But those case studies weren't my son. I thought about Catherine, about what she would tell me to do if she were sitting next to me right now. She'd been a school principal for 20 years. She'd dealt with hundreds of disciplinary cases, students who cheated, who stole, who lied to teachers and parents. And she'd held every single one of them accountable. No exceptions. No special treatment. But I also remembered how she'd come home after those meetings, exhausted and heartbroken, her eyes red from tears she wouldn't let the students see. "It's not about being cruel," she'd said to me once after suspending a student she'd mentored since 6th grade. "It's about loving them enough to let them learn. even when it hurts you more than it hurts them. I understood now, because this hurt more than anything I'd ever done. I could protect Christopher. I could quietly pay off the fraudulent loan, absorb the $38,400 loss, delete the security footage, and pretend none of this had happened. I could let him keep running the hotel and hope he'd figure it out eventually. But that wouldn't save him. It would only delay the inevitable. If Christopher didn't face this now, if he didn't experience real consequences, he'd keep making the same mistakes. He'd keep letting Natalie control him. He'd keep digging himself deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of. And one day, when I wasn't around anymore to bail him out, it would all come crashing down anyway. No. If I loved my son, I had to do this the hard way. I picked up my phone and opened a new text message to Christopher. My hands were steady, but my throat felt tight as I typed. Tuesday, 2:00 p.m. Hotel office. Don't be late. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. The reply came 12 minutes later. Okay. One word. No questions. No explanation. No attempt to reschedule or avoid it. Maybe he knew this was coming. Maybe some part of him wanted it to be over. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would present the evidence, how I would keep my voice calm and my emotions in check. I needed to be the professor, not the grieving father. I needed to be clear, rational, and firm. But when Tuesday morning arrived, I couldn't eat breakfast. My coffee tasted like ash. My hands shook when I tried to tie my shoes. At 1:30, I picked up my briefcase, double-checked that all the documents were inside, that the flash drive was secure, and walked out to my car. I loaded the briefcase onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. The drive to Savannah felt like driving toward the edge of a cliff. Every mile brought me closer to the moment I'd been dreading, the conversation that would change everything between us. I drove with my heart heavy as stone in my chest, cold and impossibly painful, weighing me down with every breath. At 2:15 on Tuesday afternoon, I pushed open the door to the back office at Forsyth Manor. The room was smaller than I expected, just big enough for a desk, a couple of chairs, and a filing cabinet tucked into the corner. Afternoon light filtered through a single window, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. Christopher was already there, sitting on the edge of a chair, like he was waiting for a doctor to deliver bad news. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Natalie sat next to him, her posture rigid, her expression carefully controlled. She had the look of someone who'd prepared for this meeting, who'd rehearsed what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. She nodded at me when I walked in. "Brian, thanks for coming." I didn't return the greeting. I just set my briefcase on the desk and sat down across from them. Christopher cleared his throat. "Dad, I held up a hand. "Let me go first." He closed his mouth and looked down at his hands. I opened the briefcase slowly, letting the sound of the latches fill the silence. Then I pulled out the first document, a stack of invoices bound together with a paperclip. LC Hospitality Solutions, I said, setting the papers on the desk between us. Does that name mean anything to you, Christopher?" He frowned and leaned forward, scanning the top page. I think so. It's one of our vendors, right? For consulting services." "Consulting services," I repeated. "And who approved these payments?" Christopher glanced at Natalie. "I'm not sure. Natalie handles most of the financial approvals." "Right." I tapped the top invoice. "According to these records, the hotel has paid LC Hospitality Solutions $3,200 every month for the past year. That's $38,400 total." Christopher's frown deepened. "Okay. What kind of consulting?" "That's a good question," I said. "The invoices are vague. Operational support. Strategic planning. guest experience consulting. But there's no documentation of any actual work being performed. No reports, no meetings, no deliverables. I pulled out another document, a printout from Kenneth Gray's audit, and slid it across the desk. Kenneth Gray is a forensic accountant, I said. I hired him to look into the hotel's finances, and he found something interesting about LC Hospitality Solutions. Christopher picked up the paper and read silently. Then his face went even paler. This says LC Hospitality is owned by Lauren Crawford. That's right, I said. Lauren Crawford, age 26, lives in Jacksonville, Florida, works in retail management. No hospitality experience whatsoever. Christopher looked up at Natalie, confusion written all over his face. Lauren, your sister, Lauren. Natalie's expression didn't change, but I saw her jaw tighten. So let me make sure I understand. I continued, keeping my voice level. Your wife has been paying her sister $3,200 a month, nearly $40,000 over the past year, for consulting services that don't appear to exist. And you had no idea. Christopher set the paper down and looked at Natalie. Natalie, what is this? She didn't answer right away. She was staring at the invoice like she was trying to decide which story to tell, but I wasn't done. I reached into the briefcase again and pulled out the next document. The loan agreement. The one with Christopher's forged signature. I set it on the desk with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the small room. And then there's this, I said. Christopher picked it up slowly. His eyes moved across the page, taking in the terms, the amount, the collateral listed. A business loan, he said quietly, for $150,000. That's right, taken out 6 months ago using the hotel as collateral. The loan was approved based on financial projections that made the hotel look profitable. But according to Kenneth's audit, those projections were optimistic at best. Christopher's hands were shaking now. I don't remember signing this. Look at the signature line, I said. He did. And I watched his face as recognition dawned, then confusion, then something darker. This, his voice cracked. This isn't my signature. The room went very quiet. Oh, what? Natalie said, but her voice sounded hollow. Christopher held the paper up, his hands trembling. This is supposed to be my signature, but it's not. The loops are wrong. The angle's off. Someone tried to copy my handwriting, but it's not mine. He turned to Natalie, and for the first time since I'd walked into that office, I saw something break in his expression. So, Natalie, he said, did you sign this? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She started, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. You forged my signature, Christopher said, his voice rising. You took out a $150,000 loan in my name without telling me. Christopher, you have to understand. Understand what? He stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the floor. You've been paying your sister thousands of dollars for fake consulting work. You forged my signature on a loan agreement. What else have you done? Natalie looked at me, then back at Christopher. For the first time since I'd arrived, her carefully constructed composure cracked. Her face had gone pale, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. It's not what it looks like, she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. I leaned forward and looked directly at my son. Christopher, I said quietly. Sit down. He hesitated, then sank back into his chair. The payments to your wife's sister, I said. The forged loan. Those are just the beginning of what's been happening. while you've been avoiding my calls for 2 months. Christopher looked at me, his eyes wide and confused and terrified. What do you mean? He whispered. I didn't answer. I just reached for the briefcase again. Because we weren't done. Not even close. Are you still watching? Leave reveal in the comments so I can see you're invested in this story. One more reminder, what follows includes dramatized elements for emotional depth. Not everything is literal fact. If that's not your preference, you're welcome to close the video. But for those staying, brace yourself. The confrontation is only halfway done. And there's this, I said. I pulled an iPad from the briefcase and set it on the desk facing them. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. Christopher and Natalie both stared at the device. Neither of them said anything. I tapped the screen and pulled up the video file. The timestamp read July 18th, 12:47 p.m. 6 months ago. I said quietly, Marcus installed a security camera system at my house. Motion activated. Saves everything to the cloud. I pressed play. The footage was crystal clear. The hallway outside my study. The front door opening. And then Christopher stepping inside, glancing around like he was checking to make sure no one was home. He walked down the hall, disappeared into my study. The angle switched to the study camera. Christopher went straight to the safe, knelt down, entered the combination without hesitation. The safe door swung open. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of bills. $15,000 in cash. Emergency money I kept there for exactly that emergencies. He shoved it into his jacket pocket, closed the safe, stood up, walked out. 3 minutes start to finish. I stopped the video and looked up. Christopher's face had gone from pale to gray. His mouth was open, his eyes wide and glassy. He was staring at the iPad like it was showing him something impossible. Dad, His voice cracked. I can explain. Can you? I said. And then he broke. It wasn't a quiet thing. It was a full collapse. His face crumpled, his shoulders shook, and he put his head in his hands and started to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn out of him. Natalie reached toward him, but he flinched away from her touch. I'm sorry. Christopher choked out between sobs. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I sat there watching my son fall apart, and I felt something twist in my chest. Part of me wanted to reach across the desk and tell him it was okay, that we'd figure it out, that I forgave him. But I didn't, because it wasn't okay, and I needed to hear the truth. Why? I asked quietly. Christopher wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. I owed money, a lot of money. To who? He took a shaky breath. I started playing poker online a couple years ago, just for fun at first. Small stakes. But then I started winning and I thought I was good at it. His voice broke again. But I wasn't. I kept losing. And I kept betting more, trying to win it back. And then I started going to casinos on the weekends when I told you I was working on the hotel. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How much? I asked. $35,000. Christopher whispered. The number hung in the air. And when the hotel opened, he continued, his voice barely audible, I couldn't pay. I'd put everything into the renovations. I didn't have anything left. So I went to people who loan money. The kind of people who don't care if you can't pay. Loan sharks. They gave me 2 weeks, Christopher said. 2 weeks to come up with $15,000, or they said they'd come after the hotel, after Natalie. They knew where we lived, Dad. They knew everything. He was shaking now, his whole body trembling. So I waited until you went to the grocery store, he said. I used the spare key you gave me years ago. I knew the safe combination because I'd seen you write it down once. And I took the money. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears. I told myself I'd pay you back. I swear I was going to pay you back. But then everything with the hotel got so complicated, and Natalie was handling all the finances, and I couldn't face telling you what I'd done. So instead, you avoided my calls for 2 months, I said. Yes. His voice was barely a whisper. I looked at Natalie. She was sitting perfectly still, staring at Christopher like she'd never seen him before. Did you know about this? I asked her. She shook her head slowly. No, I had no idea She trailed off. About the poker, I pressed. About the loan sharks. I knew he gambled sometimes, Natalie said quietly. But I didn't know it was that bad, and I definitely didn't know he'd stolen from you. There was something in her voice. Not quite disgust, but close to it. Like she was seeing Christopher as something less than she'd thought he was, and maybe he was seeing her the same way now. Because when he looked at her, his expression shifted from shame to something harder. You don't get to judge me, Christopher said, his voice raw. You've been paying your sister $40,000 for fake work. You forged my signature on a loan. That's different, Natalie snapped. How? Christopher shot back. How is that different? Because I was trying to protect this business. Natalie's voice rose. Your father gave you $500,000, and you were running it into the ground. Someone had to take control. Someone had to make the hard decisions. By stealing. By doing what needed to be done while you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself. Enough, I said. They both fell silent. I stood up slowly. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my voice level. Here's what I see, I said. Natalie, you've been funneling hotel money to your family. You forged Christopher's signature on a loan agreement. You've been manipulating the finances of a business I funded, and you've been lying about it for months. I turned to Christopher. And you, I said, stole $15,000 from your own father. You avoided my calls. You let your wife take over your business while you gambled away money you didn't have. You've been hiding and lying and making one bad decision after another. Christopher's face was red and blotchy from crying, but he didn't look away. You're both responsible, I said. Natalie for fraud, Christopher for theft and negligence. And together, you've put this hotel and Christopher's entire financial future in jeopardy. I picked up the lease agreement and held it up. Do you understand what this means? I asked Christopher. This personal guarantee, if this hotel fails, you're personally liable for over $1 million in remaining lease payments. Between Natalie's fraud and your gambling debts, you're already drowning. And if I hadn't found out, you'd have kept sinking until there was nothing left. Christopher's hands were shaking in his lap. I set the lease down and looked at both of them. You've both betrayed my trust. I said, my voice cold and steady. Starting right now, I'm taking over this hotel. By 4:15 that afternoon, the office felt like it had shrunk. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. Christopher sat slumped in his chair, his face still red and blotchy from crying. Natalie sat rigid beside him, her arms crossed, her jaw set. I remained standing. I needed the height, the authority. I needed them to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Neither of them spoke. Effective immediately, the ownership structure of this hotel is changing. I'm taking a 75% stake. That reflects my original investment of $520,000, plus the losses I've absorbed, your sister's fraudulent payments, the forged loan, the money Christopher stole from me. Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished. She closed her mouth, her eyes flashing with anger. Christopher, I continued, you'll retain a 25% stake, but it comes with no voting rights and no management authority. You are a minority shareholder with no operational control. Do you understand? Christopher nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. Which brings me to your options, I said. You have two choices and you need to make one right now. I walked around the desk and stood directly in front of him. Option A. You sell me your 25% stake for $50,000. You walk away from this hotel from Savannah and you start over somewhere else, alone, with no debt hanging over your head from me, but also no safety net. You'd be truly on your own. Christopher's hands trembled in his lap. Option B. I said, you stay, but you don't stay as the owner or the manager. You stay as an employee. You'll start at the front desk working the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. $15 an hour. You'll answer phones, check in late arrivals, handle guest complaints, and you'll do it until I decide you've earned the right to move up. I let that sink in. If you stay, I continued, it won't be easy. The staff will know what happened. They'll know you're my son, and they'll know you're starting at the bottom. Some of them will respect it. Some won't. You'll have to prove yourself every single day. Christopher looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. How long? As long as it takes, I said. Could be 6 months, could be 2 years. That depends entirely on you. And after that, he asked quietly. After that, if you've proven yourself, we'll talk about giving you real responsibility again. Management training. A path back to leadership, but only if you earn it. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. So what's it going to be? I asked. Option A or option B? Christopher closed his eyes. I watched him take a long, shaky breath. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. Option B, he said. I'll stay. Christopher, no. Natalie's voice was sharp. You can't be serious? You're going to work the front desk at your own hotel. It's not my hotel anymore, Christopher said quietly. It's Dad's hotel, and he's right. I need to start over. This is insane, Natalie said, standing up. Brian, you can't do this. Christopher is your son. Which is exactly why I'm doing it, I said. She turned to Christopher. If you do this, you're throwing away everything we built. We didn't build anything. Christopher said, his voice harder now. You stole from my father. You forged my signature. And I stole money and gambled it away. We destroyed this before it even had a chance. So that's it, Natalie said. You're just going to let him humiliate you. He's not humiliating me, Christopher said. He's giving me a second chance, which is more than I deserve. Natalie stared at him like she didn't recognize him. You're weak, she said. You've always been weak. I should have known you'd cave the moment things got hard. That's enough, a voice said from the doorway. We all turned. Marcus stood there leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, looking calm and steady in a way that made the chaos in the room feel even sharper by contrast. Marcus, I said, how long have you been here? Since this morning, he said, stepping into the room. I drove down early. Figured you might need backup. He looked at Natalie, his expression cool and unreadable. You're done here, he said. Pack your things and go. Excuse me, Natalie said. You heard me, Marcus said. You manipulated my brother. You defrauded my father. And now you're standing here calling Christopher weak because he's trying to do the right thing for once in his life. He took a step closer to her. So here's what's going to happen, Marcus continued. You're going to leave this office. You're going to leave this hotel. And you're going to stay away from my family. This isn't your business, Natalie snapped. It became my business the moment you started stealing from my father, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Now get out. Natalie looked at Christopher, waiting for him to defend her. But Christopher just sat there, staring at his hands. She grabbed her purse from the desk. Fine, she said. But don't come crying to me when this all falls apart. She stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. The three of us, me, Christopher, and Marcus, stood in the sudden silence. Then Marcus walked over to Christopher and held out his hand. Christopher looked up at him, confused. Stand up, Marcus said. Christopher did. And Marcus pulled him into a hug. You screwed up, Marcus said quietly. Badly. But you're my brother, and I'm not giving up on you. Christopher's shoulders started shaking again, but this time he didn't pull away. He just stood there and let Marcus hold him. I watched them and felt something tight in my chest finally begin to loosen. Just a little. When they finally broke apart, Marcus looked at me. So, he said. What's the plan? I pulled out a chair and sat down. The plan is we figure out how to save this hotel and how to save Christopher in the process. Marcus nodded and took a seat. Christopher hesitated, then sat down too. The three of us sat there in that small office surrounded by evidence of fraud and theft and broken trust. Outside, the hotel was still running, guests checking in, staff working their shifts, the business continuing on like nothing had happened. But everything had happened, and now we had to pick up the pieces. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be painful and slow and exhausting. But as I looked at my two sons sitting across from me, one who'd tried to warn me and one who'd nearly destroyed everything, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. A small flicker of hope. We could fix this. Maybe not today. Maybe not even this year. But we could fix it. The first Friday night at 11 o'clock, sharp Christopher appeared behind the front desk, wearing a plain white button-down shirt and a name tag that read simply, Chris. Not Christopher, not Chris Carter, just Chris. I watched from the lobby entrance as Patricia Reynolds, the general manager I'd hired 3 days earlier, met him at the desk. Patricia was 45, sharp-eyed, with 20 years of hospitality management under her belt. She'd run boutique hotels in Charleston and Asheville before semi-retiring to Savannah. When I'd called her with an unusual job offer, she'd listened to the whole story and said yes without hesitation. You must be Chris, Patricia said, extending her hand. Her voice was warm but professional. No hint of pity, no acknowledgement that the man standing in front of her was the former owner's son, starting at the bottom. Yes, ma'am, Christopher said quietly, shaking her hand. Good. Let's get you oriented. I stayed in the shadows as Patricia walked Christopher through the front desk system, the computer software, the keycard machine, the phone lines. Other staff members filtered past on their way to or from shifts. I saw a few of them glance at Christopher, whisper to each other, then look away quickly. They knew. Of course they knew. In a hotel this size, everyone knew everything. But Christopher kept his head down and focused on what Patricia was telling him. He took notes on a small pad of paper. He asked questions when he didn't understand something. He didn't make excuses or try to explain himself. At 11:30, Patricia left him alone at the desk. I waited another 10 minutes, then slipped out through the side entrance and walked to my car. I wouldn't stay and watch over him. He needed to do this on his own. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the hotel's administrative office 2 blocks away, a small converted townhouse where I'd set up my temporary headquarters. I had my own work to do. I spent the next several hours going through every contract, every vendor agreement, every financial document related to the hotel. The mess Natalie had created was worse than I'd thought. Payments to shell companies, inflated invoices, duplicate charges that had been paid twice. The first thing I did was terminate the contract with LC Hospitality Solutions. I drafted an email to Lauren Crawford, Natalie's sister, informing her that her services were no longer needed and that no further payments would be made. I copied Kenneth Gray and Howard Mills on the email for documentation. Then I turned to the $150,000 fraudulent loan. It had been taken out through a regional business lender, using the hotel's projected revenue as collateral. The terms were brutal: 12% interest balloon payment due in 3 years. If we couldn't pay, the lender could seize the hotel's assets. I called the lender's regional manager first thing that morning and requested a meeting. When he balked, I mentioned the forged signature and the potential for legal action. That got his attention. By Wednesday, we'd renegotiated. The interest rate dropped to 7%. The balloon payment was restructured into manageable monthly installments, and I personally guaranteed the loan, which meant if the hotel failed, I'd be the one paying it back, not Christopher. It wasn't ideal, but it bought us time. I also implemented new financial controls. Every expense over $6,000 now required my direct approval and signature. I reviewed every vendor, every contract, every recurring payment. If it didn't make sense, it got cut. The hotel was hemorrhaging money, but slowly, very slowly, I started to stop the bleeding. Meanwhile, Christopher was learning what it meant to work the night shift. I didn't hear about the first real incident until Saturday morning when Patricia called me at 6:30. "We had a situation last night," she said. "Guest in room 214 came down around 2 a.m. furious about his bill. Said we'd charged him twice for room service." "And had we?" I asked. "No, but the charge did look confusing on the invoice. Our software formats it badly." Chris tried to explain, but the guest wasn't having it. Started yelling, demanding to speak to a manager. "What did Christopher do?" "He called me," Patricia said. Which was the right move. I came down, sorted it out, and the guest went back to his room happy. "But your son looked pretty shaken." "How did he handle the rest of the shift?" "Fine," Patricia said. "He stayed calm, finished his checklist, and clocked out on time. But Brian, he has no idea what he's doing. He's never actually worked a front desk job before. He knows the theory, but he doesn't know the reality." "That's why he's there," I said. "I know. I'm just saying it's going to take time." "I understand. Thank you, Patricia." I hung up and sat there for a moment, staring at the stack of invoices on my desk. Christopher had spent 2.5 years thinking he was running a hotel, but he'd never checked in. A guest never dealt with a complaint, never worked a night shift when something went wrong and there was no one else to call. He'd been playing at being an owner while Natalie handled the real work, or in her case, the real theft. Now he was learning what the job actually required. At 6:45 on Saturday morning, I drove back to the hotel. I parked in the side lot and walked in through the employee entrance, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. The lobby was quiet. A couple of early risers sat in the lounge area reading newspapers. Soft music played through the overhead speakers. Christopher was still behind the front desk, finishing up his end-of-shift paperwork. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. He had dark circles under his eyes. When he looked up and saw me, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or exhaustion, or both. I walked over and set one of the coffee cups on the desk in front of him. "Black, 2 sugars," I said. "Still how you take it?" He nodded and picked up the cup. "Thanks." I took a sip of my own coffee and glanced at the computer screen. "Everything go okay?" Christopher hesitated. "There was an issue with a guest around 2 a.m. I heard from Patricia. She called me this morning." Christopher set down the coffee cup. "I didn't handle it well. I should have known how to fix the billing issue, but I didn't. I had to call for help." "You did the right thing," I said. "You recognized you didn't know something, and you asked for help from someone who did. That's exactly what you should have done." He looked at me surprised. "This isn't about being perfect, Christopher," I said. "It's about learning, and you can't learn if you pretend you already know everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You did good work tonight," I said. It wasn't much, just 4 words. But I saw his shoulders relax slightly, saw some of the tension leave his face. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. I finished my coffee and checked my watch. 6:55. "Your shift's over. Go home. Get some sleep." Christopher logged out of the computer, grabbed his jacket from the back room, and headed for the employee exit. I watched him go, shoulders slumped, exhausted, looking every bit like a man who'd just worked an 8-hour night shift for $15 an hour. But he'd shown up. He'd done the work, and he'd come back tomorrow night to do it again. 2 months into the rebuilding process, Marcus drove down from Atlanta on a Saturday afternoon. I was in the hotel office reviewing the week's financials when I saw him pull into the parking lot. He didn't come to find me right away. Instead, he walked through the lobby and headed toward the employee break room. I followed at a distance, curious. Through the hallway window, I saw Christopher sitting alone at a small table eating a sandwich during his break between day training shifts. Patricia had moved him to daytime hours for the past 2 weeks, so he could shadow the front desk operations during busier periods. Marcus knocked on the door frame and Christopher looked up surprised. I should have announced myself. Should have walked in and joined the conversation. But something made me stay in the hallway just out of sight, where I could hear their voices through the partially open door. "Hey," Marcus said. "Got a minute?" "Yeah, of course." Christopher set down his sandwich. "What are you doing here?" "Thought I'd check in. See how you're doing." There was a pause. Then Christopher said quietly, "I'm doing okay. It's hard, but I'm managing. I heard you're working the front desk now." "Yeah, Patricia's been training me. I've learned more in the past 2 months than I did in 2 years of supposedly running this place." Another pause. Then Marcus said, "You don't have to be jealous of me, you know." The words hung in the air. "What?" Christopher's voice was barely audible. "You've spent your whole life thinking I had it better than you," Marcus said. "The successful older brother, the one who didn't need Dad's help, the one who made something of himself." "Because you did," Christopher said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "You built companies. You made millions. And I stole money from our father and nearly destroyed his investment." "You think I don't have regrets?" Marcus asked. Silence. "Chris, you got something I never had." Marcus continued, his voice softer now. "You got to grow up with Dad. You got to live in the same house, eat dinner with him every night, have him at your school events. You got a full-time father." I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my chest suddenly tight. I was the weekend kid, Marcus said. The one who showed up every other Saturday, stayed for a few hours, then went back to Mom's house in Atlanta. I was a visitor in Dad's life. You were his son. But you had Mom, Christopher said. Sarah. She's amazing. She is, and I love her. But that doesn't change the fact that I spent my entire childhood wishing I could be you, wishing I could have what you had, a father who was actually there. Do you know what it's like to watch your dad drive away every Sunday afternoon and know you won't see him again for 2 weeks? There was a long silence. I didn't know, Christopher said finally. I thought you didn't care, that you were too busy being successful to need us. I cared, Marcus said. I've always cared. But I learned early on to be independent, to not need anyone, because needing people hurt too much when they couldn't be there. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. And then Catherine, Marcus continued. Your mom. She was incredible. She treated me like I was hers every time I visited. But she wasn't mine. She was yours. You got to have her your whole life. I got borrowed pieces. Marcus. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty, Marcus interrupted. I'm saying it because you need to understand something. You've spent years thinking you were the failure because you couldn't measure up to me. But I spent years thinking I was the outsider because I couldn't measure up to you. There was a sound I couldn't quite identify. A muffled sob, maybe. We both got the short end of different sticks, Marcus said. But we're still brothers, and I'm tired of us treating each other like competitors instead of family. I'm sorry, Christopher said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry I wasted so much time being jealous. I'm sorry I messed everything up. I know you are, and I forgive you. Then I heard movement chairs, scraping footsteps, and the sound of someone crying. I risked a glance through the doorway. Marcus had pulled Christopher into a hug. Christopher's shoulders were shaking, his face buried against his brother's shoulder. Marcus held him steady, one hand on the back of his head, the way you'd hold someone who was falling apart and needed to know they wouldn't hit the ground. I turned away and leaned against the wall, my own eyes stinging. This was what I'd wanted, what I'd hoped for when I forced Christopher to face his mistakes. Not just accountability, not just consequences, but healing. Real, messy, painful healing. After a few minutes, I heard their voices again, quieter now, steadier. Listen, Marcus was saying. I want to help with the hotel. You've already helped, Christopher said. You were here when Dad needed you. I mean, I want to help grow the business. I've got a team that does web design and digital marketing. We can overhaul the hotel's online presence, new website, better booking system, social media strategy, all of it. Marcus, we can't afford. I'm not charging you. This is family. You can't just give away your company's services. I can do whatever I want. I own the company. And besides, this isn't charity. It's an investment. In you, in Dad, in us. There was a pause. Okay, Christopher said quietly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're going to be the one implementing everything. I'll give you the tools, but you've got to do the work. I will. I promise. I waited another moment, then knocked on the doorframe and stepped into the break room. Both of them looked up. Their eyes were red, but they were smiling. Marcus, I said. I didn't know you were coming. Surprise visit, Marcus said, grinning. He glanced at Christopher. We were just catching up. I looked between them, my two sons so different, and yet so much alike, both of them trying in their own ways to find their place in this complicated family we'd built and broken, and were now trying to rebuild. Good, I said. That's good. Christopher stood up and grabbed his jacket. I should get back to the desk. My break's almost over. As he walked past me, he paused and put a hand on my shoulder. Just for a second, then he was gone. Marcus and I stood there in the small break room, surrounded by the faint smell of coffee and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. "He's going to be okay," Marcus said. "I know," I said. "And so are you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For the first time in months, maybe years, Forsyth Manor felt less like a business transaction and more like what it should have been all along. A family trying to find its way home. In the third month, I watched the first real results of Marcus's work come to life. The new website, ForsythManorSavannah.com, went live on a Tuesday morning in early March. Marcus's team had spent 6 weeks rebuilding it from scratch. The old site had been slow, cluttered, and difficult to navigate. The new one was clean, fast, and optimized for mobile devices. High-resolution photos showcased the courtyard, the rooms, the historic details that made Forsyth Manor special. But the real game-changer was the booking system. The old platform had been clunky, requiring guests to fill out forms and wait for email confirmations. The new system allowed instant reservations, real-time availability, and integrated payment processing. Within the first month, bookings jumped 40%. I watched the numbers come in with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. 40% wasn't just a statistical improvement. It was the difference between barely surviving and actually having a chance. Patricia called me one afternoon in late March, excitement in her voice. "Brian, you need to see this. We're booked solid for the next 3 weekends, and we've got inquiries coming in for May and June." "From the new website?" I asked. "Almost entirely. People are finding us through search engines now, and the booking process is so smooth they're converting at twice the rate we used to see." I thanked her and hung up, then sat at my desk staring at the spreadsheet in front of me. For the first time since I'd taken over, the numbers didn't look like a slow-motion disaster. They looked like possibility. By the end of April, Christopher had been working the front desk for 4 months. 4 months of night shifts, early morning shifts, guest complaints, system glitches, and late arrivals. 4 months without a single major mistake. Patricia came to me on a Wednesday afternoon with a recommendation. "He's ready to move up," she said. "He knows the front desk inside and out. He's reliable, polite, and he doesn't complain. I think it's time to promote him to guest services coordinator." "What would that entail?" I asked. "Day shift. More guest interaction, helping with tour bookings, restaurant recommendations, handling special requests. It's a step up in responsibility, but I think he can handle it. And it comes with a raise, $18 an hour." I thought about it for a moment. Then I nodded. "Set it up. But I want to be the one to tell him." That Friday, I found Christopher finishing his shift at 7 in the morning. He looked tired but steady no longer. The exhausted, broken man who'd started 2 months ago, but someone who was learning to carry the weight. "Christopher," I said, "come to my office for a minute." He followed me, quiet and wary. I gestured to a chair. He sat. "Patricia tells me you've been doing good work," I said. He didn't respond, just waited. "She recommended promoting you to guest services coordinator. Day shift, more responsibility, $18 an hour." Christopher's eyes widened slightly. "Really? Really? You've earned it." He looked down at his hands, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Thank you, Dad." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You showed up. You did the work. That's all you." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You start Monday," I said. "Patricia will train you." Over the next month, I watched Christopher settle into his new role. He worked closely with Diane Foster, our head of housekeeping, a 52-year-old woman who'd been in the hospitality industry for 30 years and didn't suffer fools. Diane was exactly what Christopher needed. She was blunt, demanding, and utterly unimpressed by the fact that he was the owner's son. If he screwed up, she told him. If he did well, she acknowledged it. No coddling, no special treatment. I watched them one afternoon as they walked through the second-floor hallway, Diane pointing out details. Christopher had missed a scuff mark on the baseboard, a light bulb that needed replacing, a towel rack that was slightly loose. Guest services isn't just about smiling and handing out brochures, Diane was saying. It's about noticing what's wrong before the guest does. It's about caring enough to fix the small things because the small things add up. Christopher took notes on his phone, nodding. You see this? Diane gestured to a doorframe. Paint's chipped here. That means we need to schedule a touch-up. You see that window? She pointed down the hall. Streaky. Housekeeping missed it. You need to catch that and let me know. Yes, ma'am, Christopher said. I turned and walked back to my office, smiling. Meanwhile, Marcus's marketing efforts were paying off in ways I hadn't anticipated. The hotel's social media presence, which had been nearly non-existent before, was now thriving. Marcus's team posted daily photos of the courtyard at sunrise, guest testimonials, behind-the-scenes glimpses of the staff at work. They ran targeted ads on social platforms, focusing on couples looking for romantic getaways and travelers seeking authentic Southern experiences. By the end of May, our follower count had grown from 800 to 12,000, and those followers were converting into bookings. Marcus was spending roughly $5,000 a month on the marketing campaign ads, photography, content creation. It sounded like a lot, but the return was undeniable. For every dollar we spent, we were seeing $3 in increased revenue. By June, our monthly revenue hit $68,000. That was up from $42,000 just 3 months earlier. We were still operating at a loss when I factored in my debt restructuring and the money I was pouring into repairs and upgrades. But the trajectory was right. For the first time, I could see a path to profitability. And then at the end of June, we got our first wedding inquiry. A couple from Charleston reached out through the website asking about hosting a small ceremony in the courtyard. 50 guests, dinner reception, overnight accommodations for the wedding party. Patricia worked with them on the details, and by the time the contract was signed, we were looking at $12,000 in revenue for a single weekend. I sat in my office that evening staring at the signed contract and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope. I pulled up the financial report for June and went through the numbers one more time. Occupancy rate 78%. Average daily rate up 12%. Guest satisfaction scores climbing steadily. Social media engagement strong. Revenue $68,000 for the month. And Christopher, my son, who 2 months ago had been stealing from me and hiding from loan sharks, was now working the day shift. Learning from Diane, interacting with guests, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding himself. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The hotel was coming back to life. Room by room, guest by guest, dollar by dollar. And so was my son. In the 8th month, I called a staff meeting. 25 people gathered in the conference room, front desk, housekeeping, maintenance, kitchen. Patricia stood in the back. Christopher stood at the front, hands clasped, shoulders tense. I gave him the floor. I owe all of you an apology, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Tracio Moma, when this hotel opened, I was supposed to be running it, but I wasn't. I let someone else take control because I was too weak and too scared. Money was stolen. Trust was broken. And you were all working for a business that was being mismanaged. The room was silent. My ex-wife defrauded this hotel, and I enabled it by not paying attention. I also made personal mistakes that hurt my father and put this hotel at risk. I'm not making excuses. I screwed up. He paused. Over the past 8 months, I've learned what it actually means to work here. I've worked the front desk. I've handled complaints at 2 in the morning. And I've realized this hotel runs because of people like you. People who show up every day and do the work. He looked around. So thank you. And I'm going to keep working to earn your trust. Diane Foster started clapping. Then Patricia. Then the whole room. Christopher's eyes went glassy, but he held it together. He nodded and stepped back. In September, I brought Jordan Hayes on board. He was 38, an interior designer from Charleston. I needed someone to coordinate weddings and events. I've never done wedding planning, he admitted. You know design and hospitality, I said. That's enough. By month's end, Jordan had transformed the courtyard string lights, updated furniture vendor partnerships with florists and caterers. Between August and December, we hosted 6 weddings, revenue $84,000. Our social media hit 15,000 followers. Occupancy climbed to 82%. Monthly revenue reached $78,000. The hotel was thriving. In mid-December, I met with Patricia and Marcus. I want to promote Christopher to assistant manager, I said. Patricia nodded. He's ready. The staff respects him, not because he's your son, but because he earned it. Marcus agreed. Do it. On a Friday afternoon, I called Christopher into my office. He sat down wary. I slid an envelope across the desk. Open it. Inside was a promotion letter, assistant manager. $45,000 per year. Effective January 1st. Christopher read it twice. His eyes widened. Dad, His voice broke. And then, for the second time since this began, he cried. Not the desperate sobs from 8 months ago. These were quieter, the tears of someone who'd been carrying weight for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. You earned this, I said quietly. I won't let you down, he said, voice thick. I swear. I know you won't. He wiped his eyes. Thank you for not giving up on me. I'm your father. Giving up was never an option. On Christmas Eve, Marcus and Christopher came to my house in Pooler. Just the 3 of us. No big gathering. 3 men around the fireplace drinking coffee. Marcus talked about his latest venture. Christopher talked about a difficult guest, about Jordan's Valentine's Day wedding plans. I sat watching my 2 sons, so different, so flawed, so deeply loved, and felt something settle in my chest. Catherine had once told me that consequences weren't punishment. They were teaching tools. Love without accountability isn't love, she'd said. It's enabling, but accountability without love is just cruelty. You need both. I'd needed both with Christopher. The hard consequences, the refusal to look away, but also the patience, the second chances, the belief he could be better. And he was better. Not perfect, not fixed, but better. Dad. Christopher's voice pulled me back. Yeah, thank you for everything. I looked at him, 32 years old, sitting by my fireplace, finally growing into the man I'd hoped he could be. You're welcome, son. Marcus raised his coffee mug. To second chances. Christopher raised his. To family. I raised mine. To both. We drank. The fire crackled. Outside, snow began to fall softly over Pooler. This was what love looked like, I thought. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that looked away when things got hard. But the kind that stayed. The kind that held people accountable and held them close at the same time. The kind that taught even when it hurt. Because Catherine had been right all along. Consequences were how life taught us. but love was how we taught each other. And sitting there with my two sons, watching the snow fall and the fire burn, I finally understood what she'd meant. We weren't perfect. We'd made mistakes, terrible, painful mistakes that had nearly destroyed us. But we were still here, still trying, still learning, still family. In March of 2023, I called a meeting with the core team. I was 71 now, feeling the years more than I wanted to admit. My back ached after long days at the hotel. My eyes tired faster when I reviewed spreadsheets. But the business was strong, stronger than it had been in years, and it was time to acknowledge that. Patricia, Christopher, Marcus, and Jordan gathered in the hotel office. I sat at the head of the small conference table and looked at the people who'd helped rebuild what had almost been lost. "I want to make a change," I said. "Christopher, you've been assistant manager for over a year. You've proven yourself. Patricia, you've been carrying the load of running this place since day one, and you've done it brilliantly." Patricia nodded, but I saw the fatigue in her eyes. "So here's what I'm proposing," I continued. "Christopher, I'm promoting you to co-manager. You and Patricia will share operational authority. Same level, same decision-making power. Salary increases to $55,000 a year." Christopher looked stunned. "Dad, You've earned it," I said. "Patricia." She smiled. "I think it's the right move. He's ready." Marcus clapped Christopher on the shoulder. "Congratulations, little brother." Jordan raised his coffee mug. "About time." Christopher looked at me, his eyes bright. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." 2 months later, Forsyth Manor got a feature in Southern Living magazine. The article was 4 pages long with glossy photos of the courtyard, the guest rooms, the historic facade. The headline read, "Savannah's Hidden Gem: How a Family Saved a Forgotten Hotel." The writer had interviewed Patricia, Christopher, and several guests. She'd written about the hotel's history, the renovation, the commitment to Southern hospitality. She'd called us a destination for travelers seeking authenticity and charm. The day the issue hit newsstands, our phones started ringing. Bookings poured in. People from Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, couples planning anniversary trips. Families wanting weekend getaways, business travelers tired of generic chains. By summer, our occupancy rate had climbed to 88%. On weekends, we were hitting 95%. Monthly revenue reached $95,000. Weddings had become our signature offering. Jordan had built a reputation for creating beautiful, intimate ceremonies. We were hosting 28 weddings a year now, generating nearly $300,000 in annual revenue from events alone. Our social media following had grown to 18,000. We weren't just a hotel anymore. We were a brand, a story people wanted to be part of. And through it all, I watched Christopher grow into the role he'd once pretended to have. He managed staff schedules. He negotiated with vendors. He handled guest complaints with patience and professionalism. He worked alongside Patricia, learning from her, deferring to her experience, but also bringing his own ideas. But I also noticed something else. Patricia was tired. She was 49 now, and she'd been working in hospitality for nearly 30 years. I'd see her in the office late at night reviewing reports, and there'd be a heaviness to her movements that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in the break room, staring out the window. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking. About," she hesitated. "My husband wants to travel. The kids are grown, and I'm tired, Brian. Not of this place. Just tired of working 12-hour days. Are you thinking about retiring?" "Maybe, not yet, but someday soon." I nodded. "When you're ready, we'll figure it out." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Thank you. For everything." I didn't push, but I started preparing for the possibility that Patricia wouldn't be here forever. Over the next year, I began pulling back. I'd spent 3 years working 6 or 7 days a week, overseeing every detail, rebuilding what had been broken. But now the hotel was running smoothly. Christopher and Patricia had it under control. So I started coming in only 2 or 3 days a week. I reviewed financials remotely. I trusted the team to handle day-to-day operations. It felt strange at first letting go, stepping back, but it also felt right. This was their hotel now, not mine. On Christmas evening of the 4th year, late 2023, Marcus, Christopher, and I sat in my living room in Pooler just like we'd done the year before. But this time the conversation was different. Christopher waited until Marcus had left to drive back to Atlanta. Then he turned to me, his expression serious. "Dad, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." He took a breath, his hands clasped together. "I want to buy back some of my stake in the hotel," he said quietly. "Not as a gift, not because you're helping me, but with money I've earned myself." I set down my coffee and looked at him. "I've been saving for 3 years," Christopher continued. "I've been tracking the hotel's value, and I've been thinking about what it means to really own something, not just have your name on paper, but to have earned it." His voice was steady, but I could see the emotion underneath. "I don't expect you to just hand it to me," he said. "I want to pay for it. Installments, fair terms, whatever makes sense. But I want to be a real partner in this business. Not your son who screwed up and got a second chance. A real partner." He looked at me directly. "So I'm asking, will you let me buy back part of my stake with money I made myself?" The 5th year, Patricia's retirement and Christopher's promotion. On a cold Tuesday morning in February 2024. Patricia Reynolds walked into my office at Forsyth Manor and said the words I'd been expecting for months. "Brian, it's time for me to go." She was 50 years old, the same age Catherine had been when we first met at a faculty dinner in 1982. Patricia had given 5 years to this hotel. 3 of them under my direct supervision, 2 more as co-manager alongside Christopher. Her mother in Charleston was 83 and needed full-time care. Her own husband had retired from the port of Savannah 6 months earlier. It was time. "I understand," I said. "And I'm grateful." "You should promote Chris," she said, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee. "He's ready." I nodded. I'd been thinking the same thing for weeks. The meeting took place the following Monday. Marcus drove down from Atlanta. Christopher arrived early wearing a navy suit I'd bought him for his 36th birthday. Patricia sat to my right. I began with the facts. Patricia was retiring effective March 1st. The hotel needed a general manager. I was recommending Christopher Michael Carter for the position with an annual salary of $65,000. Christopher stared at me. "Dad, You've earned it," Patricia interrupted. "You're not the same person who stood in this office 4 years ago." Marcus nodded. "I second that." Christopher took a breath. "I won't let you down." "I know," I said. He signed the employment contract that afternoon. But there was more. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, I invited Marcus, Christopher, and Patricia to dinner at my home in Pooler. Howard Mills joined us as legal counsel. Over roast chicken and mashed potatoes, I laid out the new ownership structure. "Here's what I'm proposing," I said, unfolding a typed document. "Ownership of Forsyth Manor Hotel, LLC, effective March 1st, 2024. I will retain 60% with voting control. Christopher will hold 25%, consisting of 10% gifted and 15% purchased. Marcus will hold 10%, reflecting his $100,000 investment in 2021. Patricia will receive 5% in recognition of 5 years of service with no payment required. Christopher looked up. "Dad, I can't afford—" "Let me finish," I said. The fair market value of 15% is approximately $270,000. You'll pay me $1,500 per month for 15 years. No interest. The payments start April 1st. Marcus leaned forward. "That's more than fair, Chris." "There are conditions," I added. "You stay clean. You keep going to Gamblers Anonymous. You run this hotel the right way. If you relapse or if you walk away, the shares revert to me." Christopher's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. "I accept." Howard slid the shareholder agreement across the table. Christopher read it carefully, asked 2 questions, then signed. Marcus signed as a witness. Patricia signed her own acceptance letter with a smile. When it was done, I raised my glass. "To the 5th year." "To the 5th year," they echoed. The numbers told the story. By the end of February 2024, Forsyth Manor was generating $102,000 per month in revenue. Occupancy had stabilized at 88% year-round, rising to 95% on weekends. We were ranked number 2 among boutique hotels in Savannah on TripAdvisor, just behind a property that had been operating since 1868. We hosted 32 weddings that year, bringing in roughly $400,000. Jordan Hayes had built a vendor network that included florists, caterers, photographers, and a bakery on Broughton Street that made the best wedding cakes in Georgia. Our staff had grown to 28 full-time employees. Diane Foster was still head of housekeeping. Marcus continued to manage our digital marketing remotely, and our social media following had reached 20,000. Christopher ran the daily operations. I reviewed the financials once a month, mostly from home. In late February, I officially retired. I kept my 60% stake, but I stopped coming to the hotel except for monthly check-ins. Christopher sent me weekly email reports. Marcus called every Sunday. Patricia dropped by occasionally to say hello and offer advice. For the first time in 4 years, I felt like I could breathe. One afternoon in late February, my phone rang. "Dad." It was Christopher. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I just wanted to ask you something." I waited. "Dad, it's been 4.5 years since you took over the hotel, since you saved me. I want to host a dinner in May to celebrate. Not just the business, not just the numbers. I want to celebrate what we rebuilt as a family." I felt my throat tighten. "I'd like you to be the guest of honor," he said quietly. "Will you come?" I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Yes," I said. "I'll be there." "Thank you, Dad." After he hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the phone in my hand. Christopher had just proposed a celebration for 4.5 years of rebuilding. 4.5 years since the worst day of our lives had become the first day of something new. The anniversary and the gift. In May of 2025, exactly 4.5 years after I'd walked into the back office of Forsyth Manor and taken control of a failing hotel, I stepped into the private dining room on the 2nd floor and stopped in the doorway. The room was filled with white lilies, dozens of them arranged in tall vases along the windowsills and on every table. Catherine's favorite flower. I hadn't asked for them, but someone had remembered. I was 73 years old. My hair was fully gray. My hands shook slightly when I held a pen. But tonight, standing in that room, surrounded by the scent of lilies and the low hum of conversation, I felt 30 years younger. Marcus was already seated near the window with his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 daughters, ages 14 and 12. Across from him sat Patricia Reynolds, 50 years old, now her hair shorter than I remembered. Beside her was Diane Foster, 57, still head of housekeeping, wearing a navy dress and pearl earrings. Howard Mills sat at the far end of the table, 75 years old, and retired, but still sharp as a blade. And then there was Christopher. He stood near the head of the table, 37 years old, wearing a gray suit and a pale blue tie. Beside him stood Emily Carter, 34 years old, an elementary school teacher from Pooler, with kind eyes and a soft voice. "Dad," Christopher said, walking toward me. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He guided me to the seat at the head of the table. Someone poured wine. The conversation was light at first, mostly small talk about the weather and the upcoming wedding season. Then Christopher stood. "I want to say something." He began, his voice steady but soft. 4.5 years ago, I sat in an office downstairs and watched my father lay out evidence of fraud, theft, and betrayal. I watched him show me a video of myself stealing $15,000 from his safe. Emily reached for his hand. He squeezed it and continued. "I had a gambling problem. I owed $35,000 to people who don't take checks. I was drowning, and instead of asking for help, I stole from the man who had already given me everything. That day, my father gave me two choices. I could sell my stake in the hotel for $50,000 and walk away, or I could stay and start over as a night receptionist earning $15 an hour. I chose to stay." He paused. "Over the last 4.5 years, I've worked every position in this hotel. 3 weeks ago, I made my final payment on the 15% stake my father sold me. I own 25% of this hotel. 10% was a gift. 15% I bought with my own sweat. Dad, you didn't save me by bailing me out. You saved me by holding me accountable." The table was silent. I felt my throat tighten. Then Marcus stood. "I want to say something too," he said. He looked at Christopher. "For a long time I resented my little brother. But 4.5 years ago I watched him fall apart. And then I watched him rebuild himself piece by piece, shift by shift, month by month. My brother showed me what courage really means. It's not never falling down. It's how you stand up from the ashes." Marcus raised his glass. "To Christopher, and to second chances." Everyone lifted their glasses. When the applause faded, I stood. "But I want to share something my wife Catherine used to say," I began. "She believed that consequences were how life taught us, and love was how we taught our children. 4.5 years ago, I gave you consequences. But I also gave you love. Not the kind that protects you from pain, the kind that walks with you through it. Catherine would be proud of you, son." Christopher wiped his eyes. We drank. We ate. We laughed. As the dessert plates were cleared, Christopher leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Dad, tomorrow morning come to the office. I have something for you." The next morning, on a warm Sunday in late May, I drove to Forsyth Manor. The lobby was quiet. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the lounge. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on the door of the general manager's office. Christopher opened it immediately. "Come in, Dad." The office had changed since Patricia's time. Christopher's desk was neat, organized, professional. A laptop sat open on one corner. A framed photo of Emily sat on the other. "Close your eyes," he said. I frowned. "Chris, please." I closed my eyes. I heard him move across the room, the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor. Then he stopped. "Okay, open them." I opened my eyes. On the wall behind his desk, mounted in a polished wooden frame, was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 15 years earlier. The headline read, "Savannah Professor Honored for Excellence in Teaching." Below it was a photograph of me, younger and smiling, standing in front of a classroom. Beneath the article was a brass plaque, engraved in elegant script, "To Brian Carter, Teacher, Father, Mentor, who taught me that responsibility is love. I stared at it, unable to speak. Christopher walked over and handed me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly. It was a receipt stamped and signed, dated 3 days earlier. At the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Paid in full, $15,000. I've been paying you $200 a month for the last 5 years, he said quietly. It's done, Dad. I've paid back every dollar I stole from you. I looked at him. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. I know it doesn't erase what I did, he said, but I wanted you to know that I finished it. I folded the receipt and slipped it into my pocket. Then I pulled him into a hug. We stood there for a long moment, father and son in the quiet office overlooking Bull Street. We sat down with coffee. We talked about the hotel, about Emily, about his plans to expand into the building next door within 5 years. The hotel was still generating over $100,000 per month in revenue. Marcus was still managing the marketing remotely. Christopher was paying me $1,500 per month for his stake, and he had never missed a payment. That evening, I sat at my desk at home in Pooler and opened my laptop. I wrote a single post on my personal blog. When you invest in your children, remember this: emotion is the foundation, but a contract is respect. A contract does not diminish love. It protects love from human error. Later, I walked out into the backyard and sat beneath the maple tree Catherine and I had planted in 1995. The sun was setting. The air was warm. I closed my eyes and whispered to her, "You were right, Catherine." Consequences taught him how to stand, and our love kept him in the family. I opened my eyes and looked up at the branches above me, at the golden light filtering through the leaves. 3 lessons remained. The lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. Emotion is information. A contract is respect. Responsibility is love. As I sit here today, reflecting on this family story that nearly destroyed us, I realize how close I came to losing my son forever. Not to distance or anger, but to something worse, to enabling his self-destruction in the name of love. If you're a parent reading this, please don't do what I did in the beginning. Don't hand over $500,000 without a contract. Don't confuse unconditional love with unconditional trust in financial matters. I taught business ethics for 34 years, yet when it came to my own child, I let my heart overrule my head. This family story taught me 3 hard lessons. First, emotion is information, not a decision-making tool. Second, a contract isn't a lack of trust. It's a framework for accountability. Third, real love sometimes looks like dad revenge. Not vengeance, but righteous anger that refuses to enable destruction. When I confronted Christopher with that evidence, some called it cold. Some said it was dad revenge, but it wasn't revenge. It was rescue. I gave him consequences because I loved him too much to watch him drown. God gives us free will, but He also gives us accountability. Throughout this family story, I kept thinking of the parable of the prodigal son. Except in my version, the father didn't just welcome the son home. He made him work in the fields first, earning back his place through sweat and discipline. That's not cruelty. That's dad revenge done right, holding someone accountable because you love them enough to believe they can change. My advice: love your children fiercely, but love them with boundaries. Trust them with your heart, but protect them with contracts. Catherine was right all along. Consequences are how life teaches us, and love is how we help them survive the lesson. Thank you for walking with me through every twist and turn of this journey. I'd love to hear your perspective. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you were in my shoes when you discovered the fraud? Would you have confronted Christopher immediately or taken a different path? Your insights matter to me, and I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, whether it stirred anger, hope, or reflection, I invite you to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. I share real stories about family failure and redemption, and I'd be honored to have you along for the ride. A quick transparency note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-life family business conflicts and psychological dynamics, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling impact and emotional clarity. If this style doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore my other content.